The morning after the final battle always arrives too quietly. Smoke drifts above the ruined fields, thinning into a pale mist that hides the scars of the earth. Shields lie where men fell, their edges cooling in the dew. Horses stand without riders. The air smells of wet iron and ash, but underneath it, something gentler grass beginning to breathe again. The silence feels almost sacred, yet no one bows to it. It is not peace they sense, but something heavier, older, waiting. Across that silence, the victors move slowly. They are told the war is over, but their bodies do not believe it. Fingers still twitch toward missing swords. Eyes scan the horizon for ghosts that no longer exist. The rhythm of survival, once endless, now stops abruptly, leaving behind a kind of vertigo. Men built for motion cannot stand still, and in that stillness, they begin to hear things that the noise of battle once drowned the weight of memory, the faint question of meaning. In the cities, rulers declare triumph. Banners rise, coins are minted, poets sing, yet beneath the celebration lies unease. For every emperor, from Rome to the far reaches of empire, peace is not safety, it is exposure. The drums of war drown dissent, but silence amplifies it. When the last enemy falls, the empire must face itself, and that is the one adversary it cannot conquer. Rome called its long, quiet Pax Romana the peace of Rome, but it was never truly peace. It was a discipline of fear, a harmony forced by legions marching through compliant streets. The roads glistened with order, yet each stone whispered of conquered nations, of languages erased for the sake of calm. The Senate called it glory, the historians called it civilization, but to those who lived beneath it, it was a quiet more suffocating than war. Peace, they discovered, could be a mirror. It showed every crack that conquest had concealed: the hunger of the poor, the vanity of rulers, the fatigue of faith. When swords slept, truth awoke. The empire that once roared with command now trembled at whispers. And so, rulers found ways to keep movement alive. Campaigns, reforms, monuments, distractions, anything to avoid stillness. For motion, even violent motion, meant control. Stillness meant reflection, and reflection was dangerous. In the fog of morning, a soldier kneels beside his weapon. The blade is chipped, but it has purpose. Without it, who is he? He was trained to defend, to destroy, to obey. Now the command is gone, and the silence speaks louder than his generals ever did. He begins to realize that his war was never against the enemy. It was against the fear of emptiness. Empires share that same fear. For centuries, they have built themselves as fortresses against quiet. Merchants, too, dread the lull. Without the movement of armies, trade slows. Without demand for armor, gold loses its luster. Priests worry that prayers sound different when no one is dying to hear them. And kings dream restless dreams of rebellion, because even peace must be ruled by something. They invent festivals, laws, new borders, each a drumbeat to drown the echo of calm. Some philosophers of the ancient world warned of this. They said peace was the true test of a civilization, not how it fought, but how it endured stillness. Few passed that test. Every empire that declared peace soon discovered the quiet rebellion of the human heart. Without an enemy to blame, it turned inward. Suspicion replaced victory, politics replaced purpose. The same fires that forged unity now burned within, consuming trust. History records wars as the milestones of time. But between them, in the blank spaces historians skim past, lie the deeper truths. The years of uneasy calm, of rebuilding and forgetting, are the most revealing. They show the delicate machinery of empire, struggling to breathe without violence. It is in those pauses that humanity is most visible and most vulnerable. Perhaps that is why the morning after victory feels heavier than the battle itself. The body can rest, but the mind cannot. The silence becomes its own battlefield, fought between memory and denial. And for rulers, it becomes a question too dangerous to answer. If war ends and nothing changes within, was there ever peace at all? The fog lifts slowly over the ruined plain. Somewhere in the distance, a single hammer strikes a soldier, reforging his blade into a plough, or perhaps back into a sword. No one can tell which. The world holds its breath, waiting to see which path will be chosen. For now, the empire calls it peace. But beneath the silence, something stirs an old instinct, restless and familiar, whispering that survival is easier than reflection. The war, it seems, has only changed its name. And as the sun rises over the quiet fields, one truth lingers in the air. When the swords fall silent, the real war begins, the one inside every empire's soul. Empires were never built to stand still. Their hearts beat not to rest, but to move an endless rhythm of conquest, trade, and ambition, disguised as destiny. When the dust of battle settled, rulers felt the weight of stillness pressing against their temples, a silence too heavy to bear. To stop was to decay, to remember, to confront the truth of what had been taken. And so they turned the wheels again, not always out of hunger, but out of fear that the gears of empire might rust. Rome learned this early. The Pax Romana, that golden illusion of calm, was sustained not by serenity, but by constant motion beneath the surface. Legions marched even during peace, paving roads that stretched like veins across continents, feeding new colonies, carrying tribute, soldiers, and whispers of rebellion back to the heart. Each road was a lifeline. Rome understood that to stay alive, the empire must never let its blood slow. Movement was order, stagnation was rot. The emperors called it civilization, yet it was machinery, an immense, grinding system, powered by human motion. From farmers bound to distant fields to merchants sailing uncertain seas, all were cogs in the grand design. A single year without expansion, without conquest or spectacle, risked collapse. The public's attention wandered, questions bloomed like weeds. So the rulers invented motion where none existed. Gladiatorial games, grand projects, new gods, new threats. The empire's heart could never stop beating, even if it had to invent its own pulse. Beyond Rome, the same rhythm echoed across steppes and deserts. The Mongols, driven by winds older than memory, embodied motion itself. Their empire was a storm that refused to settle. They conquered not to own but to move, their tents folding and unfolding like lungs. When Genghis Khan's armies paused, the silence felt unnatural, like death pretending to sleep. The steppe demanded movement, and their leaders understood what Rome once feared. Peace is a kind of death. To rest was to become prey. Each new conquest kept the tribes united, the warriors fed, the gods satisfied. The illusion of eternal progress masked an ancient terror, the fear of returning to stillness, of looking inward. When their expansion slowed, the Mongol world began to fray. Trade routes replaced warpaths, and with commerce came questions, divisions, and the slow unraveling of what had once been pure velocity. History calls this decline, but perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the body of empire finally breathing out after centuries of held breath. Centuries later, another empire would rediscover the same pattern, wearing new clothes of reason and trade. The British, inheritors of the Roman dream, built their dominion on the theology of movement. Ships became their legions, oceans their roads. The horizon itself was their altar. Every voyage was framed as progress, every colony as proof that stillness was backwardness. The sun, they boasted, never set on their empire, but what they meant was that motion never ceased. Gold, tea, opium, and souls flowed endlessly, keeping the machine alive. Yet beneath the polished surface of global trade beat the same anxious heart. The factories of Manchester and the docks of Calcutta throbbed with mechanical rhythm, mimicking war in another form. Cannons were replaced by looms, legions by steam engines, yet the logic remained. If the machines ever stopped, the silence would expose the cost, the child labour, the famine, the moral emptiness beneath the empire's polite veneer. Industry became the new conquest, each spinning gear a drumbeat to drown reflection. In every era, rulers learned that people, like machines, required purpose. War offered it freely, a story of heroes and enemies, of clear beginnings and ends. Peace offered only questions. Why had so many died? Who had profited? What was left? These questions threatened to undo the delicate fiction of unity. And so, empires replaced the battlefield with the marketplace, the front line with ideology. Patriotism, faith, and production became interchangeable tools to keep the masses turning, obedient to motion's rhythm. Historians often describe this as progress. But progress is simply motion with a story attached. The Romans paved, the Mongols rode, the British sailed. We, today, scroll. The medium changes, the machinery endures. The deeper truth is uncomfortable. Peace has never been profitable. Movement generates power, and power demands continuation. Even rest must be turned into a form of productivity. Spa empires, self-help industries, wellness economies, all selling calm through consumption, motion disguised as stillness. The empire's logic has merely shifted from legions to lifestyles. But imagine, for a moment, what happens when the gears hesitate, when the workers strike, when trade falters, when soldiers question the necessity of marching. History shows these pauses clearly: the Roman civil wars, the Mongol schisms, the British depressions. Each was not a failure of conquest, but a brief confrontation with stillness. And each time, the rulers found a new war to fight, a new frontier to chase, a new ideology to stir the machine awake. The empire's greatest fear was not rebellion, it was rest. Some philosophers whispered that this endless motion was not strength, but sickness. The Stoics of Rome, the monks of the East, the poets of the industrial age all sensed it. They warned that a civilization unable to stop would one day run past its own soul. Yet such warnings were drowned out by applause, by profit, by drums and engines. Empires are built on denial, on the belief that as long as the machine keeps turning, it will never have to face itself. Even today, their ghosts hum in our daily motion: the commute, the schedule, the endless feed of information. We tell ourselves we are free, yet we move in patterns older than empire. The gears have changed shape, but the rhythm is the same. Movement as meaning, speed as virtue, distraction as comfort. We inherited their fear of stillness without knowing its name. To the rulers of the past, peace was not the dream. It was the test that few survived. For in the quiet, memory returns. The dead are counted. The promises are weighed. To stop conquering was to start remembering, and no ruler could risk that. So they built their worlds on motion, trusting that as long as the wheels turned, no one would notice the silence beneath. And perhaps that is why every empire, in its final days, grows frantic. Rome built grander monuments. The Mongols splintered into restless heirs. Britain raced toward industrial immortality. The faster they moved, the closer they came to stillness. Momentum became madness. Progress became decay. History records these endings as collapses, but in truth, they were awakenings. The moment when the machine, exhausted, finally heard its own noise. The smoke of empire fades, the wheels slow, and the silence it feared most returns. Yet from that stillness, something else begins. Reflection, remembrance, and the fragile stirrings of humanity beneath the gears. For motion may build empires, but only silence reveals their cost. The morning light touches the edges of the world once more. The soldiers have long vanished, the ships return to dust, the roads swallowed by grass. What remains is the faint echo of a rhythm, once mistaken for life itself. The machinery sleeps, but somewhere, deep within its rusted heart, memory waits to awaken. Peace is the cruelest light. It exposes what darkness once concealed, and in that light, even kings begin to tremble. When the noise of conquest fades and the drums fall silent, rulers find themselves alone, surrounded not by enemies, but by their own reflections. For centuries they have commanded armies, bent nations, rewritten laws. Yet in the stillness of peace, they meet a force they cannot command, their own conscience. In the marble corridors of Rome, Emperor Nero once walked beneath ceilings painted with his own image. The war was over, the treasury full, and the people fed on spectacle. Yet the silence after victory began to haunt him. The crowd's cheers no longer drowned the whispers in his mind. He filled that silence with music, fire, and fear, performing as a god to hide the human beneath. He burned his city so he might rebuild himself within it, convinced that motion could erase reflection. But peace, for Nero, was the sound of every mirror cracking. His empire rotted not through invasion, but through the echo of his own voice reverberating in the emptiness of power. Centuries later, another emperor would inherit the same disease, Constantine, the man who baptized an empire. He clothed conquest in holiness, replacing legion banners with crosses, yet beneath the divine veneer, the same hunger stirred. In victory, he found unease. His empire no longer fought for territory, but for truth itself, and truth has no borders to expand, only depths to face. Peace, in his reign, became an argument, bishops debating eternity, while the emperor drifted between salvation and control. He built churches as others once built fortresses, hoping their spires would point him away from the weight of self-knowledge. But the quiet between prayers held its own accusation that he had merely traded swords for symbols. Louis XIV understood this too, though he never named it. At Versailles, he turned peace into theatre. Every corridor glittered, every garden choreographed, every sunrise began with the ritual of his own awakening. The Sun King, radiant and adored, lived within an empire of mirrors, literal and symbolic. His wars of expansion faded into banquets, his victories replaced by performances. The more peace he achieved, the more performance he required. For rulers like Louis, peace meant the stage must never end. Applause must drown introspection. Behind the silken ceremony, loneliness festered. The court danced to keep the silence from settling. This is the paradox of empire. Peace is not its triumph, but its reckoning. While war demands courage, peace demands honesty, and few rulers have ever survived it. Their empires are mirrors, reflecting their own appetites back upon them. The corruption they blamed on enemies now blooms in their courts. The decay they once buried beneath conquest surfaces in marble and gold. Palaces become prisons of ornamentation. Each statue, each portrait, each echo in the hallways reminds them of a truth they have spent their lives escaping, that their power depends upon constant distraction. Some emperors sought to fill this void with legacy. They built monuments meant to defy time, convinced that stone could silence guilt. But every monument is a confession in disguise, an admission of fragility. The pyramids, the cathedrals, the palaces of Europe and Asia stand not as symbols of confidence, but of fear. Fear of being forgotten once the noise ends. The greater the monument, the deeper the emptiness it conceals. Others turned inward, seduced by mysticism or madness. They surrounded themselves with prophets, magicians, and flatterers who promised transcendence without truth. They hoped that if they could not master peace, they could at least redefine it. Yet every whisper of eternity only deepened the echo. The divine, like peace, reflects without mercy. It does not kneel before the crown. History often calls these rulers decadent, as if indulgence were their only sin. But indulgence was not the disease, it was the symptom of stillness. They spent lifetimes outrunning silence, unable to face the fragile human beneath the crown. Their palaces grew larger, their rituals more elaborate, not because they loved beauty, but because they feared what might emerge if the music stopped. The psychology of empire is simple. Motion hides decay. Yet peace, by its nature, unmasks it. When an emperor looks into the mirror of calm, he does not see triumph. He sees the faces of those who built his throne, the weight of lives traded for glory. The reflection is unbearable, so he breaks it. Some do so with fire, others with faith, others still with gold. But the mirror always reforms, clearer than before. That is why peace never lasts, because it demands the one thing power cannot afford: self-recognition. Even the chronicles that survive their reigns seem to understand this. The tone of historians softens when war ends. Descriptions grow ornate, uneasy, filled with rumors of debauchery and excess. These are not mere anecdotes, they are the language of avoidance, history's own way of averting its eyes from the stillness it cannot explain. For the truth is not that peace corrupted empires, but that peace revealed what had always been true. As the centuries pass, the pattern repeats. Every ruler believes they can master calm, that they can command silence as they once commanded armies. But silence is not an obedient subject. It listens, records, and waits. It echoes the questions no one dares to ask aloud. What remains when the banners fall? Who are you when there is no enemy left to defeat? In that sense, the emperor's mirror is not a punishment, it is a teacher. It shows that power, stripped of motion, is simply reflection. Those who gaze long enough either shatter or awaken. The few who awaken are forgotten by history, for their stories lack spectacle. The rest are remembered as tyrants, visionaries, or fools, each merely a variation of the same tragedy, men undone by the peace they sought to claim. And so, peace never endures, not because the world is cruel, but because rulers cannot bear the weight of seeing themselves without armor. Every calm age is only an interlude, a fragile pause before the next conquest begins. For in the quiet halls of peace, a ruler finally hears the echoes of his own lies, and once heard, they cannot be silenced, only drowned beneath the next parade, the next decree, the next war. When the banners are lowered and the drums fade into memory, a strange stillness seeps into the streets. The people who once shouted for glory find themselves whispering. Markets reopen, children play, and the sound of hammers replaces the roar of battle. Yet something essential feels missing, like a melody cut off before its final note. For generations taught to march, peace feels less like victory and more like a kind of disorientation. An empire without an enemy begins to turn its swords inward. Sparta learned this truth before most. Built entirely for war, it found no place for itself once the battlefield fell silent. Every child was raised to serve the state, every heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of discipline. But when no invader came, the machine turned upon itself. Warriors became politicians, politicians became conspirators, and the citizens who once stood shoulder to shoulder began measuring one another's worth in whispers. Without an enemy beyond the walls, suspicion became their only remaining loyalty. The discipline that had once defined them dissolved into anxiety. Sparta did not fall from defeat, it withered from purpose. The story repeats like an old song. After Napoleon's wars, France found itself restless, almost bereaved. The emperor's shadow lingered across the boulevards, his statues glimmering in the rain like monuments to lost meaning. Soldiers returned home to streets that no longer needed them. A generation built for glory found itself wandering through peace, as if through a fog. The cafes filled with philosophers arguing about destiny, the salons with artists painting both triumph and despair. Outwardly, the nation rebuilt. Inwardly, it searched for something to replace the fever of conquest. When war becomes culture, peace feels like exile. Propaganda filled the gap. Newspapers spoke of patriotism, of pride, of vigilance. If there was no real enemy, one could always be imagined. For the citizens of a peaceful empire, the idea of the enemy becomes a necessity, a mirror against which to measure virtue. It gives shape to fear and purpose to boredom. The empire whispers that danger still exists, somewhere just beyond the horizon, so that its people will keep believing in their unity. Even in the modern world, the pattern remains. After the Cold War, America stood as the last great power, its rivals scattered, its ideals triumphant, yet peace brought unease. The enemy had vanished, and with it, the reason for constant vigilance. The machinery of fear, the defense industries, the political rhetoric, the nightly news could not simply stop. It shifted instead. Terrorists replaced nations, ideology replaced armies, the battlefield moved to screens. The war did not end, it simply changed costumes. Peace, once again, proved unsustainable because the people no longer knew how to live without danger. Sociologists would later call this the identity vacuum. But long before it was studied, poets and priests already sensed it. Humanity, they said, was built to struggle not always against others, but against the void that opens when struggle ceases. In that void, societies begin inventing substitutes for conflict. The Romans turned gladiators into public therapy, reenacting battle within safe walls. Modern nations turned to sports, politics, and ideology, ritualized conflict to remind the masses how to cheer, how to belong, how to divide. The uniform changed from armor to fabric, but the impulse was the same. The crowd needs its arena. The greatest fear of any state is not rebellion, it is apathy. Empires can manage dissent, they cannot survive disinterest. When people no longer feel the pulse of purpose, the economy of emotion collapses. Patriotism fades, duty weakens, and the illusion of unity begins to crack, so governments learn to weave tension into the fabric of daily life. Threats are whispered, flags are waved, and citizens are reminded that safety must always be earned. The faces of the enemy may change, but the need for them does not. This constant search for opposition becomes the heartbeat of civilization. The people begin to crave the very tension that binds them. They watch conflict unfold on stages and screens, taking comfort in the illusion that danger still exists somewhere, so long as it is not here. so long as it is not them. Without realizing it, peace becomes performance, conflict becomes entertainment, and anxiety becomes a kind of faith. When peace endures too long, the cracks widen. Classes turn against one another, ideologies harden, and whispers of betrayal fill the air. The same courage that once fought for freedom begins to fight for attention. In ancient Athens, peace gave birth to politics. In Rome, to decadence. In every empire since, to discontent. The citizens who no longer march begin to drift, their energy seeking new outlets. They argue, they vote, they riot, they forget why. What began as pride becomes competition. What began as unity becomes comparison. The war never ends, it merely changes its shape. And yet, beneath this endless restlessness, something more fragile stirs. Memory. When the enemy vanishes, people begin to remember the faces behind the banners the neighbors lost, the promises made. Empires dread this moment, for memory breeds empathy, and empathy dissolves control. That is why every regime, ancient or modern, seeks distraction at the first sign of reflection. Bread and circuses, news and noise, the forms evolve, the purpose remains. Keep the people entertained, and they will not notice that peace has made them restless. Perhaps this is humanity's oldest contradiction. We long for peace, yet feel lost when we find it. We build monuments to war and temples to tranquility, then live somewhere in between, uncomfortable with either. To be still feels unnatural, to move feels dangerous. Somewhere in that tension lies the truth of civilization, that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the moment we realize how much of our identity was built upon it. As night falls, the citizens of every age share the same unspoken thought. They look to the horizon, half hoping to see an enemy approaching, half fearing the silence that might come if none ever does. The soldiers of Sparta, the dreamers of Paris, the watchers of modern screens, all connected by the same uneasy heartbeat, the need for conflict to make sense of calm. An empire without an enemy begins to turn its swords inward. And in that reflection, the people see themselves for the first time restless, searching, unsure of what peace truly means. The silence that once promised freedom now feels like waiting for something or someone to blame, to unite against, to remind them who they are. And as history turns its wheel once more, the stage is set for a new invention, a new illusion, the manufacturing of enemies yet to come. Empires don't fear invasion, they fear boredom. A quiet population is a dangerous thing not because it plots revolt, but because it begins to think. Thought breeds questions, and questions weaken obedience. So the wise rulers of history learned a darker art. If peace cannot be avoided, it must be haunted. Fear, they discovered, is the truest foundation of loyalty. In Rome, the emperors perfected it. When the empire grew too vast for real enemies to matter, they invented new ones. Beyond the northern borders lay barbarians, faceless, godless, ever approaching. The Senate spoke of them as shadows pressing against civilization's edge, though most senators had never seen one. The people believed, because belief was easier than silence. The myth of the barbarian kept the empire united. The more uncertain life became, the more fear served as order. Rome's borders shifted endlessly, not from invasion, but imagination. The frontier was never a line on a map. It was a mirror held up to the public mind. Fear became currency. Emperors traded it like gold. When taxes rose, when bread thinned, when corruption spilled into daylight, the blame always drifted outward to the others, the unseen hordes, the rebels, the heretics. A frightened people rarely look up. They look sideways. It was easier to distrust a neighbor than to question a ruler. And so Rome endured, not because it conquered, but because it convinced. Its greatest victories were not on the battlefield, but in the theatre of fear. Every empire since has copied that performance. The Mongols spoke of cursed lands beyond their reach. Medieval kings warned of witches and infidels. The Spanish crown found enemies in the New World, and the church in every thought that wandered beyond doctrine. The Ottoman sultans named invisible plots. The Chinese emperors saw traitors in their scholars, and the modern states of Europe replaced demons with ideologies. The language changed, the ritual did not. Fear is not the opposite of peace, it is its engine. Propaganda, born from that realization, became oxygen for power. Its rhythm is ancient and familiar. First, identify the threat. Then repeat it until it feels inevitable. Dress it in symbols. Feed it through stories. Finally, offer safety at a price. The citizen accepts the bargain, believing they are defended, when in truth, they are simply managed. The Romans did this with public decrees. Modern rulers do it with headlines. The method is timeless because the psychology never evolved. We are creatures built to sense danger, even when none exists. Empires, therefore, need only whisper. Consider the 20th century, an age that promised enlightenment, but perfected manipulation. The Cold War transformed fear into industry. Two superpowers divided the planet not to destroy each other, but to sustain themselves. The world became a chessboard, the citizens' pawns moved by televised panic. Fear kept the factories running, the armies funded, the ideologies alive. Each side mirrored the other, each preaching freedom while demanding obedience. The invisible war was not between nations but between truth and convenience. The louder the speeches grew, the less anyone noticed the sameness beneath the slogans. This, too, was learned from Rome. When the empire could no longer win real wars, it learned to win emotions instead. Bread and circuses softened the masses, but fear sharpened them again. The state learned to alternate between comfort and terror like a pulse: fear, relief, fear again. It became a cycle so familiar that people mistook it for stability. They began to need it. Fear was no longer an imposition. It was home. That is the secret the emperors understood. A frightened citizen does not rebel, they cling. Fear becomes the glue that binds a fractured society, the melody that keeps the dancers moving in step. Even religion, once a refuge, was turned into an instrument of anxiety. Eternal damnation replaced earthly punishment. Heresy became treason against heaven. Every empire, sacred or secular, learned to govern not through swords, but through stories. Modern governments have inherited that craft with chilling grace. The methods are quieter now, more refined. The enemy is not always a nation, it may be a virus, a migrant, a word, an idea. It may even be boredom itself, dressed as existential threat. Television, politics, digital feeds, all pulse with the same rhythm. Fear, promise, repeat. The volume rises with every crisis, until calm feels unnatural. Peace becomes the space between warnings, and the people, conditioned by centuries of manipulation, confuse stillness with danger. Even in democracies, fear thrives because it feels like participation. To be afraid is to belong. One shouts, one argues, one chooses sides. The illusion of freedom masks the reality of control. Ancient Rome had its amphitheatres. We have our timelines. The spectacle remains, the audience has simply learned to applaud from home. If empires need fear, so too do their citizens. Without an external threat, life loses its narrative. People begin to turn inward, and that is where the true enemy waits, not in foreign lands, but in forgotten conscience. The rulers know this, they sense it in every calm season. That is why fear must never sleep. Even the smallest rumor of danger keeps the machinery humming. As long as the public trembles, the system breathes. Sometimes the fear outlives the empire that created it. Long after Rome fell, the idea of barbarians lingered, reshaped, renamed, recycled. Every century finds its replacement. Every ruler rediscovers the same incantation. They are coming. It does not matter who they are. The phrase itself is enough. It awakens the primitive certainty that safety requires submission. And once that submission is given, it rarely returns. The politics of fear is, at its core, the politics of memory. Rulers remind the people not of what they are, but of what they might lose. A golden age, a sacred land, a way of life always under threat, always in need of protection. The people become archivists of anxiety, preserving the stories that keep them chained. The irony is that fear makes them feel alive, while it quietly steals the life they imagine defending. Night falls on every empire the same way, not with invasion, but with exhaustion. The people, drained by centuries of vigilance, grow numb to their own obedience. Fear, once vivid, becomes background noise. When that happens, rulers panic. They invent new dangers, louder ones, hoping to reignite the pulse. If none appear, they turn to myth, and that is where history begins to blur into faith. For when all earthly enemies are conquered, only invisible ones remain. The politics of fear gives way to its older sibling, the mythology of evil, chaos, and eternal vigilance. Every empire, once its borders are secure, seeks a demon to replace the enemy it can no longer find. And so, the story continues. Fear becomes belief. The battlefield moves from land to soul. The empire survives, not by armies, but by the ghosts it keeps alive in the minds of its people. If evil disappeared, empires would have to invent it. Every civilization, once its borders were secure, began to fear something it could not see. Armies could hold territory, but not the mind. And so, the old rulers learned a subtler form of control, one that outlived swords and walls. They learned to build enemies out of air. They gave them names, stories, faces carved in shadow. The devil, the infidel, the heretic, each one a necessary darkness to keep the light in business. The Roman world, weary from endless wars, discovered this early. When its enemies were conquered, it turned to heaven for new ones. The early Christians, once hunted themselves, inherited Rome's machinery of fear. Evil became institutional, codified, diagrammed, and given an address in the invisible. The new frontier was no longer the edge of the empire, but the boundary of the soul. And peace, now reframed as moral danger, became something to be watched with suspicion. The church whispered that calm was the devil's camouflage. True safety lay only in vigilance. The Byzantine Empire perfected this spiritual paranoia. Within its golden walls, where theology was politics and politics theology, the enemy was never far. Heresy became treason, and every argument about the nature of God carried the weight of a civil war. Councils assembled not to reconcile peace, but to redefine it. Icons were banned, restored, and banned again, each reversal, a battle dressed as devotion. The Byzantines called themselves guardians of divine truth, yet beneath the mosaics of angels and saints lay the same ancient fear. That stillness invited chaos, and that chaos, once awakened, would devour everything they built. To the east, in the Islamic caliphates, a similar story unfolded with different words. The early scholars and imams spoke of fitna, the trial, the temptation, the internal fracture that follows comfort. They warned that prosperity breeds weakness, that the soul, like an empire, must be kept alert. The faithful were urged to wage jihad al-nafs, the struggle within lest complacency become defeat. Even paradise, they said, required eternal vigilance. Thus the idea took root that peace itself must be patrolled, guarded, mistrusted. The battlefield of faith stretched infinitely inward. In medieval Europe, this invisible war reached fever pitch. The church became both fortress and empire, and its greatest invention was not salvation, but fear. The devil was everywhere in forests, in whispers, in thought. Peace was recast as temptation, the quiet before spiritual collapse. A good Christian was never still. He was always watching, confessing, repenting. Monks in stone cloisters kept endless vigil, convinced that sleep invited demons. Entire towns performed rituals not to live but to ward off unseen invasion. The bells of the church marked the hours not of rest, but of defense time itself divided into intervals of vigilance. Through sermons and art, the myth of the eternal threat spread like holy fire. The sculpted gargoyles that crouched above cathedrals were not decorations. They were reminders, embodiments of the chaos that forever circled civilization. To walk beneath their gaze was to remember that safety was conditional. Heaven's protection depended on fear's endurance. The devil was never meant to be defeated. He was meant to be believed in. His presence gave purpose to obedience, profit to penance, and legitimacy to power. The beauty of this design lay in its invisibility. Wars could be lost, kingdoms could crumble, but the enemy within the imagination could never die. The idea of evil became self-renewing, endlessly adaptable. A ruler might fall, but his priests would still whisper that danger slept beneath the surface, that peace was only a test, that vigilance was a virtue. And so, even in times of prosperity, the people knelt in anxiety, waiting for the next judgment, the next sign, the next savior. Fear evolved into doctrine, and doctrine became economy. Indulgences, relics, pilgrimages, all sold as shields against invisible foes. Salvation acquired a price tag. The faithful bought amulets and prayers the way soldiers once bought armor. The priests called it mercy. The merchants called it business. and the people, exhausted by centuries of invisible wars, paid gladly. Better the illusion of safety than the burden of peace. In this way, the myth of the eternal threat seeped into the bloodstream of every empire. Even after faith fragmented, the structure of belief remained. The vocabulary changed, demons became ideologies, heresy became dissent, but the pattern endured. Governments, like churches, discovered that invisible enemies are the most profitable kind. They require no borders, no evidence, only emotion. And yet, beneath this machinery of fear, a quieter truth persisted, one that mystics and heretics whispered but could never shout. They said that evil and order were not opposites, but twins. That peace and chaos were parts of the same rhythm, one giving meaning to the other. The universe, they claimed, was not a battlefield but a balance. Such words, of course, were forbidden. Empires cannot afford balance. They require tension. Without fear, faith drifts. Without darkness, authority dims. Even in art, the myth endured. Painters filled cathedrals with scenes of battle between angels and demons, but always with the same composition. Light triumphant, yet dependent on the shadow beneath it. The message was clear: peace could exist only as victory, never as acceptance. Harmony was war's prettiest disguise. And so, generation after generation, the people prayed against an enemy that lived within them. The monks fought temptation. The rulers fought heresy. The scholars fought doubt. All believed they were defending truth. Yet what they truly defended was the structure of fear itself, the endless vigilance that kept empires awake. It is easy to see the pattern now, in hindsight. Every age believes it is more enlightened than the last, yet each inherits the same myth in new language. The heretics of Byzantium become the dissenters of modern states. The fires of Inquisition become the floodlights of surveillance. The symbols change, but the ritual endures. The empire always needs its shadow. If evil ever truly vanished, the machinery of power would collapse. The priests would have no sermon, the rulers no cause, the merchants no market. Peace would reveal itself not as triumph, but as emptiness, a silence that terrifies more than any war. And so, to protect themselves from that silence, civilizations continue the ancient work, inventing demons, naming ghosts, feeding the fire. For in every age, under every banner, one truth remains. Fear is the architect of faith, and faith, in turn, keeps fear alive. The two walk hand in hand through history, inseparable, whispering the same promise that safety is only possible when danger never ends. Peace doesn't end wars, it ends paychecks. Every empire learns this truth too late. The banners fall, the treaties are signed, and suddenly the drums stop beating. But when the noise fades, another sound emerges, the quiet groan of an economy built entirely on motion. War, for all its cruelty, has always been profitable. It fuels industries, sustains hierarchies, and gives meaning to the circulation of gold. Peace, by contrast, is an interruption. It freezes the current. It makes people count instead of spend. And in the counting, empires discover how much of their greatness depended on destruction. Rome felt it first. The empire's wealth had flowed from conquest, from the glittering cargo of defeated provinces, grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, tribute from every direction the eagles flew. The Senate called it divine order, but it was simple arithmetic. War paid for peace. Soldiers brought home spoils that filled treasuries and fed the illusion of eternity. Yet when the frontiers quieted, the numbers no longer added up. The armies still needed to be fed, the roads maintained, the temples gilded, but the provinces no longer bled gold. The emperors tried to invent substitutes. They taxed the living to replace the plunder of the dead. They devalued their coins, stretching silver into deceit. They seized temple treasures and melted them down for the wages of soldiers who no longer fought. The empire's peace became more costly than its wars. The same legions that had once marched in triumph now guarded tax collectors from mobs of their own citizens. Rome, for all its power, was held together by the ghost of momentum. A machine too vast to stop, too fragile to continue. Centuries later, another empire would meet the same fate, though it spoke in the language of trade rather than conquest. Britain's sunlit empire glittered with commerce, but its wealth still pulsed to the rhythm of conflict. The colonies provided raw materials, the navy protected the routes, the factories at home turned war into employment. Every musket built, every uniform stitched, every ship launched carried wages and hope. The empire's moral language, civilization, progress, order, was only a translation of its financial one. War was its economy, peace its reckoning. Then came the silence after World War II. The factories slowed, the colonies demanded freedom, and the bills arrived. For centuries, Britain had exported its unrest, now it had to import reality. The empire that had once financed its peace through the labour of others found itself paying for its own. Decolonization was not mercy, it was bankruptcy. The debts of victory outweighed the spoils. Britain emerged triumphant in name, but hollow in substance, an empire that had won the war and lost the world. Peace is expensive because it demands accountability. In war, debt can be postponed. In peace, it arrives with interest. The machines built for battle must either be dismantled or repurposed. The soldiers must be paid, the widows supported, the fields restored. Empires that once measured their worth in victories now face the arithmetic of survival. The historian may call this reconstruction, but beneath the word lies a confession that war had been the simpler business. Even the moral language of civilization depends on the circulation of conflict. When rulers speak of stability, they usually mean control. When they promise prosperity, they mean productivity. Both require movement, the turning of gears, the exchange of fear for labor. When that movement stops, the illusion weakens. Factories close, wages fall, and suddenly the empire discovers that its peace produces no profit. The people who once cheered its conquests begin to question its costs. So, the rulers adapt. They find new kinds of war, wars of trade, of influence, of ideology. The battlefront becomes the market, the soldier becomes the worker, the weapon becomes the advertisement. It is still conquest, only quieter. Profit replaces plunder, supply replaces tribute. The empire survives by disguising motion as morality. It tells its people that endless growth is peace, that consumption is virtue, that expansion is destiny. But beneath the language of progress beats the same old heart, restless, anxious, dependent on movement. In that sense, the world never left Rome. The coins are digital now, but they still buy obedience. Governments fund economies through defense contracts, innovation through rivalry, and unity through fear. Peace is not absence of conflict, it is redistribution of it. The battlefield becomes invisible, the economy its new terrain. Every empire, at its peak, believes it can afford morality. Only when the profits fade does it rediscover how fragile that virtue is. The Romans called it decline, the British called it austerity, the modern world calls it recession. The names change, the mechanism does not. When war ends, the wealth it generated lingers like smoke, dissipating faster than anyone expects. The generals retire to politics, the merchants to speculation, the workers to restlessness. And soon, someone, somewhere, begins to whisper of opportunity. A border unsettled, a rival rising, a market untapped. Peace, for all its beauty, is not a natural state for economies built on conquest. It asks the impossible, that the machine which thrived on fire should learn to live on air. And so, rather than face collapse, empires rekindle the flames. A small war here, a conflict there, just enough to keep the furnaces warm. They call it defense, intervention, deterrence. The words are chosen carefully, polished by accountants and priests alike. Behind each one hides the same truth, that without conflict, the empire would starve. Even religion, once the moral brake upon greed, learned to speak in economic tongues. Tithes, indulgences, holy wars, all promised salvation in exchange for contribution. The sacred and the financial became indistinguishable. Every donation, every prayer, every sacrifice became a transaction in the marketplace of redemption. In such a world, peace itself began to feel like heresy, a state without profit, a stillness without sale. And so, the illusion continues. Empires declare peace with one hand and sign new contracts with the other. Factories retool, banks adjust, merchants adapt. The engines of civilization hum quietly beneath the rhetoric of stability. To the common citizen, life seems calm. To the rulers, It is balance a fragile equilibrium between rest and ruin. In truth, peace has never been free. It is the most expensive illusion ever purchased, paid for by memory, by vigilance, by the perpetual readiness to begin again. The Empire's accountants know this. Their ledgers are written not only in numbers but in names. The quiet after victory is not the sound of healing. It is the sound of counting of debts, settling, of promises measured. The soldiers return, the banners fade, but the bills remain. And somewhere, deep within the vaults of every civilization, the same truth echoes through the ledgers. Peace doesn't end wars, it ends paychecks. When greed wears the mask of virtue, peace becomes a sin. Every empire eventually learns to sanctify its appetites. It begins with banners and trade routes, with merchants whose ledgers hum louder than prayers. Then comes the language to justify it, all a vocabulary where conquest becomes calling and profit becomes piety. The gods are persuaded to bless the voyage, and the coin is stamped with their image. Thus is born holy commerce, that quiet marriage of cross and cargo that turned ambition into salvation. The Crusades were its first grand sermon. Pilgrims marched not only for heaven, but for silk, spice, and land. Priests promised remission of sins, and bankers promised interest. Between them, a theology of movement took shape, a belief that expansion itself was sacred. Armies carried relics in one hand and contracts in the other. Cities fell beneath banners painted with saints, yet the true relic was gold, gleaming beneath the dust of faith. Those who died were called martyrs, those who profited were called chosen. Peace, to such minds, was heresy, a refusal to serve the divine machinery of growth. When the Crusades ended, their spirits sailed west. The same creed that sanctified Jerusalem now sanctified discovery. The Spanish and Portuguese set their sails under heaven's gaze, convinced that new worlds awaited conversion. Priests walked beside conquistadors, sprinkling holy water over cannons and contracts alike. Each island taken, each people subdued, was recorded not as theft but as baptism. The church received souls, the crown received gold. The ledger balanced in paradise and treasury both. And when doubts arose, sermons reminded the faithful that the earth itself was a marketplace of divine purpose. To stand still was to defy providence. The English mastered the ritual with colder precision. Their merchants founded companies in the name of God and profit the East India Company, a new kind of crusade, trading incense for opium, sermons for charters. The mission was moral as well as material, to civilize, to enlighten, to teach the virtues of purchase. The Bible traveled beside the musket, the school beside the factory. Each transaction was a prayer, each colony a congregation. By making commerce a moral act, the empire turned every subject into a believer. To consume was to participate in destiny. Peace, that dangerous stillness, was recast as laziness, even sin. Movement equaled progress, and progress was proof of grace. Within this theology of trade, even suffering found its place. Poverty was interpreted as divine test, wealth as divine reward. The merchant's success confirmed heaven's favor, while the laborer's toil ensured its continuation. The moral scales tilted until generosity looked like weakness and accumulation like duty. In such a world, conquest could never truly end, for it had become invisible, a daily ritual performed through exchange, prayer, and price. What made this transformation complete was the language of redemption. Every empire taught its children that expansion was not greed, but gift. They were spreading light, order, civilization. To trade was to uplift. To convert was to save. The slave ship was renamed the missionary vessel, the colony, a school. And in this sanctified commerce, everyone found absolution. The soldier fought for faith. The merchant traded for glory. The ruler governed for the soul of man. The victims disappeared into the footnotes of divine arithmetic. Yet beneath the hymns, another story whispered. In marketplaces from Venice to Goa, from London to Cairo, the coins themselves began to bear silent witness. Their worn surfaces told a truth older than empire, that money, once blessed, becomes immortal. Kingdoms rise and fall, but currency endures. It crosses borders more faithfully than any missionary. It is the true pilgrim of history, carrying with it the scent of sanctified greed. By the 17th century, theologians themselves began to speak in economic parables. Salvation was interest deferred. Virtue was investment in eternity. The Protestant work ethic turned daily labour into liturgy. The holy day shortened, the workday lengthened. Each invention, each voyage, each transaction became part of an invisible cathedral, the global market disguised as divine plan. The faithful no longer needed miracles. Profit was proof enough of grace. And so, a new creed replaced the old, not in Deo confidimus, in God we trust, but in credit we believe. From this moral alchemy emerged the modern illusion of progress. Empires called it destiny, economists called it growth, but its logic was the same as the Crusaders: move or perish. To pause was to lose favour, to fall behind, to invite decline. The globe became a temple of perpetual expansion, every factory a shrine, every ledger a prayer book. The worship of movement replaced contemplation. Velocity became virtue. Even today, its echoes hum through our screens and markets. The sermons are digital now, but their message is unchanged. Keep going, keep buying, keep building, for stillness is sin. But the prophets of peace still appear, quietly and rarely. They speak of balance, of enough, of the holiness of rest. They remind us that every empire which mistook motion for meaning eventually consumed itself. Rome marched until it broke its own spine. Britain traded until its coffers emptied. The faith of progress demands endless sacrifice, and when there are no lands left to conquer, it turns inward, devouring its believers. Yet history is merciful. It leaves behind the ruins as warnings, the scriptures of exhaustion written in stone. The temples of commerce, the old docks, the silent mills, the broken trade halls stand like empty churches, echoing the same forgotten prayer: that peace, once cursed, was the only true wealth. When greed wears the mask of virtue, peace becomes a sin. And until that mask is lifted, every empire, whether draped in banners or balance sheets, will mistake its hunger for purpose and its profit for grace. For some men, the quiet is louder than the war. When the battle ends, the soldiers do not. They walk away from the field, but the field follows them, clinging to their boots, living in their blood. The smell of smoke, the echo of commands, the rhythm of survival lingers long after the weapons fall silent. Peace is announced like a holiday, yet for those who fought, it feels like exile. They are told they can rest now, but rest has become a foreign country. The Romans knew this long before psychology gave it a name. Legionaries returning from campaigns in Gaul or Judea often wandered the streets of Rome like ghosts, unable to fit among the merchants and poets. The city they had fought for felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. They slept in courtyards, woke to imagined alarms, and found themselves flinching at the sound of a dropped amphora. Some re-enlisted not from loyalty, but from habit. The war had become their only heartbeat. Without it, the silence pressed too close, too deep. One fragment of a veteran's letter survives a man named Lucius, writing to his brother. "The walls of the house are too still," he said. "At night, I dream that the enemy hides behind the furniture, and when I wait for orders that do not come." 2,000 years later, the same words could have been written by a soldier from Stalingrad or Vietnam. The centuries change their armor, but not their silence. When an empire raises its sons for war, it teaches them how to fight, but not how to stop. The training never ends, it merely moves inward. Marching becomes memory. The mind continues its patrols long after the body stands down. At night, sleep becomes a negotiation, the past demanding entry, the present trying to hold the door. Some manage to build lives, to marry, to work, but beneath every conversation hums the low drumbeat of memory. For others, the silence grows unbearable. They seek noise taverns, crowds, machines, anything to drown out the echo. The empire calls this adaptation. In truth, it is survival by distraction. The Middle Ages were filled with such men-knights who had known nothing but campaigns. When peace descended, they became restless wanderers, founding orders of mercenaries to keep the old rhythm alive. The Church, aware of their danger, tried to sanctify their restlessness. God's peace, they called it, the truce of the Lord. But even faith could not quiet the pulse of habit. Men who had lived by the sword could not live by prayer. They rode to crusades and border wars, not because they believed, but because they could not sleep. One monk, writing in the 12th century, described a former knight who came to his monastery seeking peace. He prayed, the monk wrote, but his hands moved as if grasping a weapon. His eyes searched the shadows for banners. After a year, the knight left. The monastery gates closed behind him, and he vanished into the wilderness. Some said he found war again. Others said he found silence. Either way, both were the same thing. The pattern endures. In every generation, the soldiers return to Rome, to Paris, to New York, and find that the war continues inside them. Their bodies carry it, like a second heartbeat. Their minds replay it, searching for meaning in what was once instinct. The modern age calls it trauma, but the ancients might have called it haunting. For to be haunted is not to be cursed by ghosts, but to carry them within. There are diaries from the trenches of the First World War that sound almost identical to Lucius's letter. One soldier wrote, "The quiet at home is unbearable. The clock ticks too loud. The air is too clean. I missed the noise because it meant I was alive." In another, from a British veteran, the words come slower. "I walk through the market and imagine artillery between the stalls. People laugh, and I cannot understand how. Empires depend on such men. Their discipline builds roads, their endurance builds myths. Yet when peace arrives, they are the first to be forgotten. Statues are raised, parades are held, but the veterans stand at the edges, faces half in shadow, half in disbelief. They have been trained to endure everything but normality. And when the crowd disperses, they are left once again in the company of silence. Some try to explain it in simple terms: adrenaline, habit, the body's addiction to danger. But the truth runs deeper, almost spiritual. War offers clarity. It reduces life to survival, decision, command. Peace restores complexity. In that complexity, meaning dissolves. The soldier who once knew exactly who he was, defender, destroyer, brother, killer, returns to a world that asks him to forget. Yet forgetting is impossible. The mind keeps its archives too well. Even in art, the wound reveals itself. Roman mosaics once celebrated victory soldiers with laurel crowns, eagles in flight. But in later centuries, the same motifs darkened. A tired figure leaning on a spear, a face turned away from the viewer. The glory faded into contemplation. Modern paintings echo the same descent: the soldier at a window, the helmet on the table, the eyes unfocused. Peace, for the artist, is no longer a subject of triumph but of uncertainty. For some, sleep returns eventually, but it is never the same. It comes in fragments, in uneasy intervals. The dreams are vivid, then vanish at dawn, leaving only the taste of metal and the feeling of motion. These men and women become the quiet custodians of history. They carry its weight silently, as if afraid that speaking it aloud might wake it again. They live between two worlds, one that remembers too much, and one that prefers to forget. And yet, within that haunting lies something noble. The soldier who cannot sleep is not merely broken, he is honest. He has seen the cost of movement, the machinery of empire, the hunger disguised as virtue. His restlessness is truth refusing to fade. In his insomnia, the empire's conscience stirs. For peace may silence the cannons, but it cannot silence memory. The battlefield remains invisible, internal, eternal. And in that darkness, the soldiers who forgot how to sleep stand watch for all of us, guarding not the borders of nations, but the fragile boundary between remembrance and oblivion. When war ends, its ghosts teach the children how to dream. No civilization forgets violence, it only learns how to sing about it. The lullabies that soothe the next generation are stitched together from the fears of the last. Every story told beside a hearth, every melody passed from mother to child, carries fragments of battle within it, softened by rhythm, disguised as heritage. The echo of war does not fade with peace, it simply changes its form, hiding inside memory until it becomes culture. In ancient Sparta, children were rocked to sleep with songs of valor. The melodies were tender, but the words were iron, teaching them to love courage, to scorn weakness, to die beautifully. Long before they held a sword, they already carried one in their hearts. What was once trauma became tradition. Fear, recited often enough, began to sound like pride. By the time they marched to war, they were only fulfilling the prophecies sung over their cradles. The Crusaders did the same. Their hymns rose from blood-soaked soil and echoed across cathedrals. To the faithful, they were prayers. To history, they were memories rehearsed into ritual. Each chorus praised sacrifice and sanctified violence. Pilgrims sang them on the road to Jerusalem, merchants hummed them on ships bound for profit, and children in quiet European villages learned them in school. They believed they were praising God, but they were really praising endurance, the ability to turn pain into purpose, loss into meaning. In this way, every note carried forward the echo of the battlefield. Even in modern times, the rhythm remains. Nations that survive great wars weave those wars into identity. Flags become relics, memorials become temples. The soldier's letter becomes scripture quoted in textbooks, carved into stone, repeated in ceremonies meant to preserve unity. And yet, beneath the reverence, something darker persists. When grief becomes performance, the wound never closes. The rituals meant to honor peace end up keeping war alive. In post-war Japan, poets wrote of cherry blossoms falling as souls returning from battle. Delicate, transient, beautiful. In Europe, brass bands filled the air with victory marches that sounded suspiciously like lamentations. In America, cinema transformed war into myth, turning trauma into spectacle. Each generation claimed to remember, but what they truly inherited was longing, a strange nostalgia for struggle, for clarity, for the moment when good and evil seemed simple. The mind, unable to bear the chaos of modern peace, reaches back toward the structure of conflict. The echo deepens in language itself. Phrases of battle become everyday speech. Defend your honor. Fight for love. Conquer your fears. The grammar of survival lingers long after the need for it is gone. Even the stories we call fairy tales carry traces of war heroes, armed with swords, kingdoms under siege, monsters slain in the name of order. These tales, told to calm children, are really instructions from the past. How to live in a world built on violence, how to justify it as destiny. The songs, the words, the rituals all serve the same hidden purpose: to make the memory of conflict livable. Empires cannot survive unhealed trauma. They must recycle it into virtue. So they turn their wounds into symbols. A scar becomes a medal, a ruin becomes a monument, a massacre becomes a lesson. The people learn to find beauty in endurance, to mistake survival for sanctity. In this way, the echo of war becomes the music of civilization. But memory is never neutral. What begins as commemoration often ends as justification. The Spartans' songs prepared new warriors. The Crusaders' hymns inspired new crusades. Even modern anthems, written in mourning, are sung before new battles. Peace becomes a brief intermission in the long performance of memory. Each generation inherits not only the trauma, but the rhythm, the need to march, to build, to overcome. The echo becomes prophecy. One can trace it in art, in the brushstrokes of painters who never saw the battlefield, but painted its absence, in the slow, mournful music of nations that claim victory yet sound defeated. The war lives on in their color palettes, in their harmonies, in the silence between their notes. It is as if humanity, having once learned to speak through violence, cannot imagine any other language. And yet, within that haunting lies a strange tenderness. The letters of soldiers, stained with dirt and longing, are kept for centuries, not because they glorify war, but because they prove love endured it. The mothers who sing lullabies of courage are not praising death, they are begging their children to survive it better. The poets who describe ruins are not worshipping destruction, they are warning against forgetting. Trauma, when shared honestly, can become compassion. It is only when it is stylized, polished, choreographed, performed, that it turns back into myth. In every empire, there comes a moment when remembrance becomes repetition. The monuments grow higher, the ceremonies louder, the stories more ornate. History, exhausted by its own suffering, begins to decorate it. And once that happens, peace cannot last. The echo demands another note, another war to justify its song. The cycle begins again, not out of malice, but out of inheritance. Humanity passes down fear the way it passes down language, unconsciously, reverently, believing it to be wisdom. But if one listens closely, beneath the marching drums of history, there is another sound softer, uncertain, but alive. It is the whisper of those who tried to break the pattern. The nurses who refused to sing the old lullabies, the writers who left their pages blank, the survivors who chose silence over ceremony. They understood that forgetting is not betrayal, and that true peace is not built from memory, but from release. Still, their voices are faint compared to the echo. The children grow, and the songs return. The empire rebuilds, and the statues rise. The ghosts that once walked the battlefields now stroll through classrooms and holidays, disguised as pride. And the world, yearning for safety, finds itself once again preparing for its own awakening of violence. When war ends, its ghosts teach the children how to dream. They dream of glory, of courage, of sacrifice, dreams born from nightmares. And as they grow, they learn to hum the old melodies, to polish the old myths, until the next generation mistakes them for truth. Thus, the empire's memory survives not in books or monuments, but in the quiet between a mother's song and a child's breath. The echo carries forward, patient as time itself, waiting for the moment when it will no longer be memory, but prophecy once more. They called it peace, because no one dared to speak. For 2 centuries, Rome claimed to live under the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, a name whispered like a blessing across the known world. Roads stretched like veins from the heart of the empire to its furthest edges. Laws were engraved in marble, aqueducts shimmered under the sun, and poets sang that war had been tamed. Yet beneath that polished surface, another reality pulsed, quieter, colder, and infinitely more controlled. Peace, in Rome, was not an end to violence. It was simply violence perfected. The peace of Rome began, as all peace does, with exhaustion, after centuries of conquest, civil wars, and assassinations. Augustus offered the people what they longed for: stability. He promised safety, prosperity, and order, but at a price no one could refuse. Freedom was traded for quiet, and quiet became law. The Senate still met, but only to agree. The legions still marched, but now in the name of preservation, not conquest. Augustus called it harmony. The poets called it golden. Yet in the alleys of the provinces, soldiers patrolled as if the wars had never ended. Peace, to Rome, meant surveillance. From Britain to Syria, tax collectors carried imperial writs, sealed in wax and threat. Every census, every decree, every ledger reminded the conquered that the empire still watched. Even silence became a form of tribute. Governors ruled not by trust, but by paperwork, endless reports sent to emperors who feared the absence of news. When rebellion flickered, it was crushed not by armies but by auditors, accountants, and laws written so precisely they strangled. The Roman road, that marvel of civilization, was a double-edged symbol. To merchants and travellers, it meant progress. To those beneath the eagle, it meant reach. Along those stones, soldiers could appear in days where once they'd taken months. The same path that carried olive oil and letters also carried legions. Peace, it seemed, was only the pause between inspections. The empire's heartbeat could be heard in the measured steps of its patrols. Taxes were the true language of this tranquility. Tribute from the provinces kept the marble gleaming and the aqueducts flowing, but it also chained entire nations to the empire's comfort. Egypt fed Rome, Gaul paid for its temples, Judea financed its wars. Every loaf of bread eaten in the forum was a whisper from a distant field, harvested by hands that would never taste it. The empire called this order. Its subjects called it hunger. Even Rome's religion bowed to administration. Temples became branches of governance. Priests served as bureaucrats of morality. Sacrifices were recorded like receipts, each prayer accounted for in public ritual. The emperor himself became divine, not through miracles, but through paperwork decrees of holiness, stamped with his own image. To question him was heresy, to disagree was treason, and so, peace endured, not because people believed, but because belief had been replaced by habit. Writers of the time felt the suffocation but dared not name it. Tacitus, careful as a man walking a frozen lake, wrote that the silence of the provinces was mistaken for contentment. Others hinted that Rome had achieved a new kind of conquest, not of land, but of thought. The empire no longer needed to fight. It had convinced the world that resistance was disorder, and disorder was sin. In this way, peace became the most efficient weapon Rome ever wielded. Even beauty was recruited into obedience. Statues of emperors lined the forums, their eyes forever gazing outwards, serene, paternal, unblinking. Architecture became a theology of control. The grand arches and colonnades were designed to awe, to shrink the human spirit beneath proportion and stone. Citizens were meant to feel grateful for their insignificance. Rome called it civic pride. Its subjects felt it as submission carved in marble. Occasionally, the illusion cracked. A governor pushed taxes too far, a legion mutinied, a prophet spoke too loudly in some distant province. The empire's response was always the same: swift, total, quiet. The Senate would announce restoration, the poets would compose odes, and the people, weary and afraid, would return to their assigned peace. The empire was a stage, and everyone played their part, willingly or not. Yet beneath the surface, the tension grew. A system built on silence requires constant maintenance. The more Rome tried to preserve its calm, the more brittle it became. Surveillance multiplied, punishments stiffened, spies whispered in taverns, and citizens learned to smile carefully. In this curated tranquility, real emotion became rebellion. Joy, grief, anger, all were measured, monitored, minimized. By the 2nd century, the empire had become a museum of itself. Roads still stretched, statues still stood, but the vitality that once forged them had drained away. Rome's peace was no longer a promise, it was a performance. The emperors, draped in ceremony, mistook the stillness of fear for the stillness of devotion. They called it unity. History would later call it the beginning of decay. To walk the Roman streets at dusk in those years was to feel the paradox made flesh. The fountains murmured, the lamps glowed, and somewhere, beneath the hum of order, one could sense the quiet discontent of millions: farmers, slaves, poets, merchants, each keeping their thoughts unspoken. The empire's true monument was not its architecture, but its silence. They called it peace because no one dared to speak. And as the centuries passed, that silence became the standard by which all future empires measured themselves: not peace through harmony, but peace through exhaustion. The pattern would repeat: palaces built on stillness, prosperity masking obedience, order mistaken for virtue. Rome taught the world that tranquility could be conquered, that submission could be renamed civilization. It proved that fear, if managed elegantly, could last longer than faith. The emperors called this achievement eternal. They were wrong. The silence they built would one day echo elsewhere in other languages, beneath other flags, as the same illusion reborn. The Pax Romana was never peace. It was empire learning how to hide its sword. The empire didn't end, it just changed its accent. When Rome's marble cracked and its eagles fell, the world did not lose the dream of empire, it merely learned to speak it in English. Centuries later, Britain would inherit that legacy not through inheritance of blood, but through imitation of method. The British Empire perfected what Rome began: control disguised as civilization, domination veiled as destiny. It was an empire that learned to smile while it tightened its grip, to teach while it took, to preach peace while it practiced quiet war. They said the sun never set on its dominion. It was meant as a boast, but it sounded like a curse, a reminder that somewhere, at every moment, someone lived under its shadow. Across continents and oceans, red ink spread over maps like the veins of a great mechanical heart. India, Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, each a cog turning within a system that never slept. Peace, in such a world, was not rest, it was management. The British called their empire the bringer of order: railways, schools, law, industry. The rhetoric was noble, the reality less so. The rails moved soldiers as efficiently as goods. The schools replaced memory with obedience. The laws protected trade, not people. Where Rome had ruled by sword, Britain ruled by ledger. It discovered that a nation could be conquered, not through armies, but through credit, contracts, and currency. The banks became its legions, the shipping lanes its frontiers, the company its crown. The East India Company was the prototype, a nation masquerading as a merchant. It waged wars, collected taxes, minted coins, and dictated policy to kings. In its ledgers, conquest appeared as arithmetic, plunder as profit. When rebellion flared, it was extinguished in the name of stability. When famine struck, it was catalogued as misfortune. The empire's greatest invention was not the machine or the steamship, it was moral invisibility. It learned to erase the connection between comfort and cost, between the tea in the parlour and the blood in the fields. Even in its supposed peace, Britain fought. It waged economic wars through tariffs and monopolies, cultural wars through language and faith. Missionaries carried Bibles into villages already burning from debt, and teachers taught that civilization spoke only one tongue. The empire's genius lay in its ability to convince the conquered that peace was privilege, that obedience was progress, and gratitude was enlightenment. Its victims were told they were lucky to serve history. And yet, beneath that polished surface of order, the same machinery of surveillance and fear that sustained Rome turned once more. Colonial administrators kept exhaustive records of every tribe, every custom, every whisper. Information replaced iron as the instrument of control. The census, the photograph, the passport, all born in the empire's quiet laboratories of power. To know was to rule. To catalogue was to conquer. The peace of the British world was built not on silence alone, but on data. This illusion of benevolence became its most powerful export. Even as independence movements rose, Britain sold its narrative to the world, that empire had been a teacher, not a tyrant. Its monuments were not statues of generals, but libraries and universities, its victories retold as philanthropy. In this rewriting, the colonized were cast as students, the empire as mentor. The lesson was obedience dressed as gratitude. But peace built on hierarchy is only postponement. Beneath the calm of the colonial century, revolutions simmered like buried embers. In India, the muted rage of famine victims grew into songs of rebellion. In Africa, the languages that empire tried to erase were whispered back into being. In Ireland, poets replaced muskets, turning memory itself into resistance. The empire learned what Rome had once known, that silence, if held too long, transforms into song. By the 20th century, the British Empire began to shrink, but not vanish. Its colonies gained flags and parliaments, yet the trade routes, banks and contracts remained. Independence became administrative, not economic. The sun did not set. It simply reflected off new maps. The empire continued, rebranded as partnership, development, globalization. The uniform changed, the orders remained. Even today, its language survives not in decrees, but in design. The global economy speaks in English. Corporations trace their ancestry to colonial charter houses. The moral arithmetic of progress, growth as good, stillness as failure, remains unchallenged. The empire became invisible, dissolved into markets and media, into systems so vast they no longer need to call themselves empires at all. It conquered not land, but meaning. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the psychology it left behind. The colonizer learned to believe in his own virtue, the colonized to doubt their own worth. Centuries of hierarchy embedded themselves into gestures, accents, and expectations. A world once ruled by empire now rules itself in the same image, policing its own ambitions, fearing its own silence. The empire's greatest victory was not over nations, but over imagination. Winston Churchill once said that the British Empire was created in a fit of absence of mind. But absence of mind is rarely innocent. It was not forgetfulness that built the empire, it was convenience. Forgetting made exploitation easier, remembering made it impossible. And so, as Britain withdrew from its colonies, it built museums to contain memory artifacts behind glass, cultures arranged like trophies, the past preserved yet safely distant. Travel today through London's quiet museums, and you can still feel the old empire breathing behind the glass, the stolen idols, the foreign jewels, the fragments of nations once declared barbaric. Each display whispers a single phrase: "We brought you peace." But the peace on those labels is the same that Rome once declared: peace through possession, peace through erasure, peace through stillness imposed from above. They said the sun never set on the British Empire, but perhaps it never needed to, for the light itself had been claimed. The empire became the horizon, an idea rather than a place, a system rather than a flag. It learned that the true legacy of power is not conquest, but continuation. The ability to survive as culture, as commerce, as memory disguised as modernity. The empire didn't end. It just changed its accent. Its voice now speaks softly through markets, through media, through polite diplomacy and digital networks. It no longer demands obedience, it sells it. And as the world listens willingly, even gratefully, the old illusion persists, burnished and familiar. That order is kindness, that progress is peace. But beneath the global calm hums the same unease that haunted Rome, a stillness too perfect, a silence too rehearsed. History watches, patient and amused, waiting for the moment when the empire's accent slips, and its true voice, ancient and unmistakable, speaks again. When peace became a product, its silence was sold by the highest bidder. In the old empires, peace was a promise made by rulers to their subjects. In the modern one, it became a commodity, advertised, packaged, and distributed like perfume. The drums of war fell silent, replaced by the hum of markets. Serenity, once a fragile state of being, turned into a lifestyle, something to be purchased, performed, and posted. The world learned to sell calm, the same way it had once sold conquest. After the Second World War, the great nations faced a new problem: how to maintain control in an age that no longer tolerated open empire. The answer was elegance. Violence became economic, domination psychological. The Cold War was its proving ground, an era that called itself peaceful while stockpiling enough fire to end the planet. Each superpower promised stability, yet each lived in permanent tension. To soothe their citizens, they turned to the oldest imperial tool in new form: illusion. Posters spoke of progress, television of prosperity. The citizen was told not to fight, but to consume. Shopping malls replaced temples, the hum of industry replaced the march of armies. Happiness was measured in appliances, not victories. The peace of the modern age was transactional comfort in exchange for compliance. Nations no longer conquered others, they conquered attention. Corporations soon realized what governments had discovered: serenity could be monetized. Ads promised tranquility in the form of cigarettes, cars, vacations, and pills. "You deserve peace," they whispered, but only after purchase. The act of buying became a ritual of belonging. In this new faith of calm, to struggle was uncivilized, to question was ungrateful. The consumer was a soldier without knowing it, fighting daily skirmishes against boredom and dissatisfaction. Even the language of spirituality was rebranded. Meditation, once rebellion against material life, was reintroduced as a tool for productivity. Yoga studios sprouted beside corporate towers. Mindfulness apps offered enlightenment for a subscription fee. Inner peace became an accessory, not an awakening. The sacred was franchised, the stillness outsourced. The empire no longer needed armies, it had algorithms. Governments joined in. Propaganda evolved from posters to pixels. Images of unity, smiling families, and quiet cities flooded the screens. The message was simple: peace is progress, and progress is control. Discontent became the new heresy. Those who protested were labelled disturbers of the peace, while those who complied were celebrated as citizens of harmony. This wasn't peace as understanding, it was peace as anesthesia. The irony grew sharper with every decade. News channels broadcast calm between commercials for chaos. Politicians spoke of global cooperation while signing defense contracts. Armies were rebranded as forces for stability. Even humanitarian wars were waged in the name of peace. The very word lost its meaning, stretched to fit every justification. It no longer described the absence of conflict, but the maintenance of order. By the 21st century, peace had become a product line. Corporations sold experiences designed to mimic tranquility: spa retreats, silent headphones, digital detox weekends. Social media turned serenity into competition. Influencers posed beside oceans, framed by hashtags of gratitude and minimalism. Calm became a performance, another layer of noise disguised as silence. The image of stillness replaced the thing itself. But beneath the filters, the restlessness remained. The modern citizen, surrounded by screens promising ease, sleeps less, worries more, and feels watched by invisible forces. The empire of calm is built not on rest, but on stimulation. Endless notifications, endless needs. The illusion of choice keeps the mind occupied, just as the illusion of freedom once kept the Roman citizen loyal. The technology of tranquility is the newest instrument of control. It is no coincidence that the world's loudest century calls itself peaceful. Every advertisement that promises relaxation carries within it the same anxiety it claims to cure. Every global summit that speaks of unity hides an agenda of competition. We have inherited Rome's architecture and Britain's commerce, but perfected their illusion. We believe that motion itself is serenity. The faster we move, the calmer we claim to be. Even the global campaigns for world peace carry the scent of branding. They sell optimism like merchandise, complete with slogans, logos, and celebrity endorsements. Peace is no longer an ideal to live by. It is a cause to donate to, a banner to wave, a feeling to simulate. The act of wanting peace has become part of the economy that prevents it. This is the new Pax Mundi, not a piece of empires, but of markets. It stretches across borders, currencies, and ideologies. It speaks softly in humanitarian tones, while quietly enforcing compliance. It tells the rich to feel enlightened and the poor to be grateful. It teaches us to chase serenity without ever finding it, to buy relief instead of rest. The planet hums with the low, mechanical rhythm of contentment on credit. And yet, somewhere beneath the slogans and the static, humanity still senses the difference. We know, instinctively, that true peace cannot be purchased, that silence cannot be owned, that stillness cannot be streamed. Late at night, when the screens dim and the music stops, a strange unease settles in. It is the same silence the old emperors feared, the one that makes us think. The industry of calm, for all its sophistication, has never learned to profit from reflection. The world does not crave more serenity, it craves meaning. But meaning cannot be sold, and so the empire turns to newer distractions. Artificial worlds promise perfect peace, digital heavens without hunger or doubt. Yet even there, the human heart rebels. Stillness, when faked, feels hollow. Peace, when forced, feels like surveillance. The cycle continues, glittering and exhausted. The governments call it stability. The corporations call it growth. The people call it life. But somewhere, under the weight of advertisements and optimism, the old truth whispers again. When peace became a product, its silence was sold by the highest bidder. And as the noise grows softer but never truly stops, we begin to wonder not whether peace exists, but who owns it. True control doesn't need soldiers, just silence. Once, power announced itself with parades, banners, and drums. Now it whispers. It hides behind the hum of servers, the glow of screens, the soft algorithms that know what we desire before we do. The age of noise has birthed a new kind of quiet, not the peace of still water, but the calm of sedation. It is the silence of a world too distracted to notice it is being managed. In ancient empires, control required force. In the modern one, it requires attention. The methods are subtle, elegant, almost invisible. Governments no longer burn books, they bury them beneath entertainment. Information no longer disappears, it drowns. The flood is the censorship. The modern citizen, overwhelmed by content, no longer asks what is missing. They scroll, they consume, they sleep. The silence grows louder with every click. This managed calm began, like all empires' illusions, with good intentions. After the wars of the 20th century, nations promised their people stability. They built institutions to prevent chaos, bureaucracies, treaties, networks of surveillance dressed as safety. The cameras were installed for protection, the data collected for efficiency, the filters designed for civility. But over time, the machinery of peace began to hum without oversight, and the hum became the lullaby of the age. The result was not tyranny, but something more sophisticated: apathy. The population, numbed by choice, ceased to resist. They mistook fatigue for peace, distraction for freedom. The empire discovered that the most obedient citizen is not the frightened one, but the entertained one. A screen in every hand replaced the soldier on every street. The world became self-governing through convenience. Social media perfected this silence. It turned communication into noise and noise into cover. Beneath the endless chatter, genuine dissent vanished. Outrage became a spectacle, reform a hashtag, revolution a meme. The illusion of speech hid the absence of voice. Everyone could talk, so no one was heard. Every opinion was permitted, so none were dangerous. In this democracy of distraction, silence was not imposed. It was chosen. Corporations learned to harmonize with this new order. Their products promised empowerment while tightening dependence. The phone that connected you also tracked you. The platform that gave you a voice also sold your attention. The entertainment that soothed you also measured your behavior. Peace, once a social ideal, became a psychological product, a mood maintained by software. Calm was no longer natural. It was curated. Governments applauded. They found in technology a tool the Caesars could only dream of, total surveillance disguised as participation. No empire in history has known its citizens so intimately, or controlled them with such gentleness. The state no longer needs to silence the rebel. It can drown them in relevance, surround them with comforting distractions until rebellion itself feels impolite. The citizen who questions too loudly is not imprisoned but ignored, a ghost scrolling among ghosts. Even the news learned to speak the language of sedation. It no longer informs. It reassures. Crises are packaged between commercials. Atrocities share the screen with recipes. The rhythm is deliberate. Shock, comfort, repeat. The goal is not awareness, but endurance. To keep the viewer anxious enough to stay, yet calm enough not to act. Fear and fatigue dance together until the mind forgets which is which. It is easy to mistake this managed silence for progress. There are no gulags, no public executions, no visible chains. The streets are peaceful, the markets thrive, the people smile. But beneath that calm, the machinery turns algorithms, predicting unrest before it happens, data brokers selling profiles of behavior, corporations whispering to governments what people will tolerate next. The result is an empire without emperors, a system that rules through rhythm, not decree. True censorship, in this new order, is not the deletion of words, but the dilution of meaning. 1,000 voices, repeating the same slogans, achieve what a dictator's gun could not. Consensus without conviction. The population becomes self-regulating, ashamed of anger, suspicious of intensity. The ultimate victory of the managed silence is psychological, to make resistance feel unreasonable. Even art, once the natural enemy of control, has been pacified. It decorates rather than disrupts. It soothes rather than stirs. Museums display rebellion as nostalgia, while cinema sells revolution as comfort. The dangerous edge of creation has been rounded into content infinite, accessible, and harmless. The artist still speaks, but through a microphone owned by the empire. And yet, somewhere in this landscape of curated calm, something restless stirs. Human nature, as ancient as fear itself, resists silence. The same impulse that once built cathedrals and burned tyrants now manifests in strange ways, in satire, in leaks, in brief flashes of unfiltered truth that cut through the haze. Each is quickly buried beneath new distractions, yet each leaves a trace, a tremor in the fabric of the managed world. Power senses this unease. That is why it tightens the algorithm, refines the feed, improves the filter. It learns from dissent faster than dissent learns from itself. Every criticism becomes data. Every act of rebellion becomes a trend to monetize. The system grows stronger through exposure. It thrives on opposition, so long as the opposition remains predictable. The silence, paradoxically, is loudest where it seems most alive. This is the great paradox of the modern era. We have never spoken more, yet said less. Never been more connected, yet more isolated. Never been more informed, yet less aware. The empire of calm is global now, woven into the very architecture of daily life. It does not need armies or idols, only habits. It rules not through threat, but through suggestion. True control doesn't need soldiers, just silence. But silence, once imposed for too long, begins to crack. Beneath the soft hum of civilization, the old human restlessness endures that ancient refusal to be lulled forever. The same spark that ended kings and burned temples still flickers beneath the screens. It waits, as it always has, for the moment when managed silence becomes unbearable, and people begin to listen again, not to their devices, but to themselves. And when that happens, when the calm can no longer contain its contradictions, history will do what it always does. Wake up. Every peace ends the same way, with a whisper that becomes a roar. No empire, no system, no illusion lasts forever. Beneath the calmest surface, pressure gathers, invisible but patient. It seeps through generations, through silence, through obedience, until the weight of unspoken truth becomes unbearable. And then often, suddenly, always shockingly, peace cracks. Not because people desire chaos, but because they can no longer breathe within the stillness. The French Revolution began not with fury, but with hunger. For decades, France had cultivated an image of grace and reason, a monarchy gilded in ceremony, a society that called itself civilized. Beneath the chandeliers, however, the peasants starved, the thinkers whispered, and the truth, fermented like wine, left too long uncorked. The government's calm was not tranquility, it was paralysis. And when the whisper finally broke in pamphlets, in taverns, in the streets, the explosion was inevitable. The guillotine became the symbol of that eruption, but its true engine was memory. Centuries of silence had turned into a ledger of grievances. Each injustice recorded, each tax remembered, each insult sharpened. When the dam broke, it was not anger that flooded out, it was recognition. People saw, for the first time, the architecture of their oppression laid bare. Peace had been their prison, revolution their breath of air. Yet even revolutions are haunted by the ghosts of the peace they destroy. The French people, having torn down their monarch, soon found themselves longing for order again. The calm returned, dressed in new colours, the empire, the republic, the bureaucracy. History had shifted its furniture, but not its design. Every peace that follows rebellion carries the seeds of its next collapse. A century later, Europe would learn this again. The early 1900s were called La Belle Époque, the beautiful age. Cities glittered with art, science, and commerce. The old powers congratulated themselves on their civility, their diplomacy, their long peace. But beneath the waltzes and the world fairs, the ground was moving. Colonies bled, alliances tangled, industries fed on quiet exploitation. It was an age convinced of its progress, deaf to its own arrogance. The calm of Europe was not stability, it was compression. When the First World War erupted, it did so almost politely: telegrams, treaties, declarations. Then the machinery awakened, and the illusion shattered. The peace that had seemed eternal dissolved into trenches, mud, and mechanized despair. The soldiers who marched out under banners of honor returned home, broken, disillusioned, and old before their time. The world realized, too late, that the century's peace had been nothing more than a pause between storms. Even in the aftermath, the illusion tried to rebuild itself. The League of Nations promised eternal order, borders were redrawn, and the victors called the new age secure. But memory, once awakened, refuses to sleep. The bitterness of defeat, the humiliation of debt, the propaganda of pride, all simmered beneath the treaties. 2 decades later, the roar returned, louder and more terrible than before. It is a pattern as old as civilization. Silence, tension, eruption. Empires call it peace, historians call it the prelude. Each calm age contains its own rebellion, waiting to be named. In 1989, another illusion cracked softer, but no less profound. The Berlin Wall, long the concrete symbol of peace enforced through division, began to crumble. The world watched in disbelief as citizens climbed its edges, chipping away the stone with hammers and bare hands. There were no legions this time, no thunder of cannons, only the quiet sound of walls surrendering to memory. The Cold War's peaceful balance had masked decades of fear, poverty, and surveillance. When it broke, it did so through laughter and tears, through songs shouted across a collapsing border. What made that moment remarkable was not its drama, but its gentleness. It reminded the world that revolutions need not always bleed. Sometimes the whisper alone is enough when it carries truth, when it refuses to be silenced. The fall of the wall was not merely political, it was spiritual. A collective exhale after half a century of holding its breath. Yet even then, the old habit returned. The victors declared a new era, the end of history, they called it. Democracy and markets had triumphed. The world would now know perpetual peace. But the cracks reappeared almost immediately. Invisible at first, in inequality, in isolation, in digital manipulation. The shape of empire had changed, not its nature. The world believed it was free, even as it began to monitor itself. History is a patient teacher. It knows that every system, once convinced of its permanence, begins to decay. The peace that follows revolution often feels eternal precisely because the next storm has not yet gathered. But the pattern endures. Stillness breeds blindness. Blindness breeds eruption. The only question is how loud the next roar will be. Every age has its whisperers, those who sense the tremor before the quake. Philosophers, poets, journalists, the nameless few who see beyond the propaganda of calm. They are rarely believed. In the salons of pre-revolutionary France, the thinkers were mocked as alarmists. In the 1,910 seconds, the pacifists were branded naive. In the 1,980 seconds, the dissidents were told the wall would stand for a century. The empire always scoffs at the whisper until it becomes the roar. When peace cracks, it does not do so randomly. It breaks along the lines of truth long denied. A nation may endure poverty, but not hypocrisy. It can tolerate hardship, but not humiliation. The greater the illusion, the more violent the awakening. What erupts is not chaos, but honesty. The sudden recognition that the calm was a lie. Every peace ends the same way, with a whisper that becomes a roar. And when it comes, it does not ask permission. The flags that once fluttered for unity are torn down by the very hands that saluted them. The streets fill not with enemies, but with citizens remembering who they are. The empire calls it anarchy. History calls it revelation. In that moment, the managed silence of generations collapses into sound. The sound of people reclaiming their voices, of walls falling, of nations breathing again. The peace that was imposed dissolves, and in its place arises something raw, uncertain, and real. It does not last, it never does. But in the instant of awakening, humanity glimpses itself unfiltered. The illusion fades, and for a heartbeat, truth stands naked in the light. That is the real revolution. Not the destruction of order, but the rediscovery of honesty. Every piece cracks. The question is not if it is when, and what we will hear when it does. Only in ruins do empires finally tell the truth. When the banners fall and the marble cracks, something remarkable happens. Silence returns, but not the managed kind. This silence is raw, tender, almost holy. It is the breath drawn after centuries of shouting. The empire, stripped of its illusion, stands naked before time. The statues no longer command, the palaces no longer persuade. What remains is not glory, but honesty. The quiet revelation that everything built to last was built to end. After every collapse, the first thing reborn is humility. People wander through the broken streets and see, for the first time, what their ancestors mistook for permanence. The grandeur of what was once invincible becomes dust that clings to their shoes. The walls that once carried proclamations now carry ivy. And yet, amid the wreckage, life begins again, fragile but unafraid. Children play where soldiers once marched. Artists paint on the sides of fallen monuments. The world exhales, and truth seeps through the cracks. The ruins of Rome whisper this lesson. The empire that called its peace eternal left behind only fragments, arches, aqueducts, inscriptions half erased by rain. But in those fragments lies something greater than power, memory. The Romans, who once sought to conquer eternity, now exist within it not as rulers but as teachers. The stones that once oppressed now inspire. The violence that silenced poets now fuels them. The empire's failure became humanity's inheritance. In every age, ruins perform the same quiet miracle. They remind us that destruction is not the end of meaning, but the return of it. The fall of Constantinople revived the art of the Renaissance. The ashes of Berlin birthed philosophies of conscience. Hiroshima's devastation gave rise to the language of peace movements. The end of an age is not the death of the world, it is the shedding of its delusions. From the rubble, the essential always survives. When the machinery of empire stops turning, people rediscover the small, unprofitable acts that make them human. They build gardens in the shadow of collapsed factories. They carve music out of grief. They teach one another not how to win, but how to listen. The value once measured in conquest becomes measured in kindness. It happens quietly, without decree or ceremony, as if the earth itself guides them back toward balance. Art, the first language of recovery, thrives amid the ruins. In broken places, creativity grows wild, free of markets, free of control. The survivors write, sing, paint, not for fame or order, but for understanding. The artist becomes priest, the poem a prayer, the melody a confession. From despair emerges beauty not built to last, but to heal. History proves it again and again. After the fire, the human spirit blooms like grass through stone. In these moments, peace ceases to be an institution and becomes an instinct. It is not decreed by rulers or negotiated by diplomats. It grows out of shared fragility, the mutual recognition that we have all suffered, that we all bleed the same, dream the same, long for the same quiet. The survivors of great collapses often speak softly, as if afraid to wake the ghosts. Their peace is not prideful, but cautious, a fragile truce between memory and hope. The paradox of ruin is that it restores perspective. The empire believed itself divine. Its ruins prove it was human. Every collapsed monument becomes a mirror reflecting the truth the builders refused to see, that nothing is sacred except compassion, nothing eternal except change. For centuries, power tried to manufacture peace through control. But peace, real peace, begins only when control is gone. It arrives like rain after fire, not imposed, but inevitable. Even nature participates in the confession. Grass fills the courtyards of palaces, birds nest in the mouths of statues, rivers reclaim their courses, washing away the borders men drew with such confidence. The world does not mourn empire, it digests it. The trees grow where thrones once stood. The wind whispers through cathedrals, erasing sermons of conquest. The planet itself is the great editor, removing arrogance 1 century at a time. And through it all, humanity begins to remember. The survivors gather stories from the wreckage, piecing together meaning from the fragments. They no longer ask who ruled, but what endured. They speak less of nations and more of neighbors, less of triumph and more of tenderness. The grand narratives dissolve, replaced by small, luminous truths, that love matters more than victory, that silence can heal, that the soul of a civilization is not its monuments, but its mercy. Only in ruins do empires finally tell the truth. They confess what their chronicles hid, that greatness is fragile, and that every golden age was built upon someone's silence. The rubble reveals what prosperity concealed, that the pursuit of peace through dominance only leads to exhaustion. It takes collapse to remember that peace cannot be commanded, only cultivated. Perhaps that is the hidden mercy of destruction, that it resets the human heart. In the aftermath, people rediscover one another, not as roles but as beings. They help, they forgive, they rebuild without knowing they are already wiser than their ancestors. They no longer dream of empire, they dream of enough. And yet, within that fragile stillness, a question lingers. Will we remember this lesson? Or will comfort, once restored, lure us back into illusion? History suggests the cycle will continue. But maybe, somewhere in the ruins, someone will write the words that break it. A child painting on a fallen wall, a poet writing by candlelight, a voice saying quietly, "Never again." Peace, real peace, is not the reward of victory but the humility of loss. It comes when we no longer need to rule, when we accept that being human is not to dominate but to endure. The ruins remind us. They are not warnings, but invitations to build differently, to dream more gently, to see clearly. For in the end, every empire falls, but what it leaves behind determines what we become next. And perhaps, one day, the truth we find beneath the ruins will finally be enough to stop the cycle, not through fear, not through silence, but through understanding. Only in ruins do empires finally tell the truth. And in that truth, peace at last begins. Every peace treaty is just a blueprint for the next war. When the smoke clears and the speeches end, the builders return, not the masons and farmers, but the planners, the financiers, the dreamers of new dominions. They arrive quietly, carrying pens instead of swords, and promises instead of threats. The ruins are still warm, when the next architecture of conflict begins to rise. History, patient and precise, begins drawing its next circle. It has always been this way. After every collapse, the survivors swear they have learned their lesson. They build monuments to peace, carve doves into marble, and write treaties that seem unbreakable. Yet beneath the signatures, familiar patterns take root. Power reassembles itself, cautious at first, then confident. The bankers reopen their ledgers, the generals their maps, and the poets their dreams of destiny. Humanity, unable to resist motion, begins again. The Renaissance was born from the ashes of medieval war, a bloom of art, reason, and humanism. But behind the frescoes and cathedrals, another engine turned. Banking families, like the Medici, discovered that peace could be more profitable than battle for a time. They financed kings, sold security, and stabilized currencies. Yet in doing so, they created new hierarchies of dependence. When debts came due, wars returned to balance them. The cannon gave way to contracts, the sword to credit. The economy of conflict simply learned a new language. By the 17th century, Europe's rulers had refined the process. They called it diplomacy, but it was arithmetic territory exchanged like currency, treaties drafted like ledgers. The Peace of Westphalia, hailed as the birth of modern order, also sowed the seeds of modern rivalry. Borders drawn in ink soon demanded defense in blood. The architects of peace designed their own undoing, mistaking symmetry for stability. The Enlightenment brought philosophy, science, and the idea that reason might tame war. Yet the same rational minds built the machinery of empire systems so efficient they made conquest appear civilized. The British and French, proclaiming liberty and progress, expanded their reach until half the planet bent beneath their ideals. Peace became a missionary word, spreading like a contagion across continents. Each empire believed its version of order would last forever, and each built the foundations of its successor's rise. Even revolutions, those eruptions of hope, produced their own architects of conflict. After the storming of Bastille came the committees, the charters, the armies of liberation. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in the name of equality. The world, watching, realized that ideology could replace monarchy without altering the rhythm of conquest. The rhetoric had changed, the geometry had not. The pattern grew sharper in the modern age. After the carnage of World War I, Europe swore to bury militarism forever. The League of Nations was born a fragile cathedral of paper, its pillars made of hope. Yet beneath its chambers, old alliances whispered. Economic desperation brewed extremism. Humiliation fermented revenge. Within 20 years, the peace that was meant to end all wars had prepared the stage for one far worse. The blueprints had been drawn with trembling hands, but the lines still led to fire. When the Second World War ended, the architects returned again, older but not wiser. This time, they built global systems, the United Nations, the World Bank, NATO institutions, meant to guard peace through balance. Yet balance is only another word for tension. The Cold War that followed was not a failure of diplomacy, it was its perfection. Two powers circling one another, promising peace through mutual fear. The nuclear age transformed war into abstraction, making destruction so vast it became theoretical. Humanity lived in an age of uneasy calm, comforted by the illusion that deterrence was safety. The strategists of that era believed they had achieved something new, peace through strength. But strength by nature cannot rest. It must grow, adapt, justify itself. The Cold War became the industrialization of vigilance. Every advance in technology, every leap in science, carried within it the seeds of control. Satellites watched, codes listened, economies turned in synchronization with defense budgets. Even when the Berlin Wall fell, the infrastructure of paranoia remained. By the 21st century, the architects had moved into new disciplines. Economists became generals, and coders became spies. The battlefield shifted from geography to information. Nations waged silent wars through currency, data, and influence. Each new technology, promised as a tool of peace, became another weapon. The digital age did not end conflict, it privatized it. Corporations replaced armies, and servers replaced forts. The war never stopped, it simply changed its medium. Every peace treaty, every summit, every promise of stability conceals the same paradox. Control requires vigilance, and vigilance breeds fear. The institutions meant to preserve harmony become instruments of hierarchy. Banks enforce order, treaties enforce obedience, algorithms enforce conformity. The old generals have been replaced by administrators who speak in the language of efficiency, global stability, economic equilibrium, data security. But beneath these terms lies the same old truth. Peace must be managed, and management demands power. History's irony is cruel but consistent. The moment a civilization believes it has secured peace, it begins designing the conditions of its next collapse. The wealth that once funded recovery becomes inequality. The networks built for cooperation become cages. The pride of survival curdles into arrogance. Each generation inherits a version of calm and unknowingly mortgages it for comfort. And somewhere, in the quiet rooms of think tanks or trading floors, new blueprints are drawn, plans for weapons, sanctions, rivalries, each justified as protection. Perhaps this is humanity's most persistent delusion, that war is an interruption rather than an expression of civilization. In truth, the two are twins, born of the same impulse, the desire to control chaos. Peace builds the systems, and war resets them. Between them lies only the illusion of choice. Yet, amid this fatal rhythm, individuals continue to hope. Each era produces its visionaries, its believers in reason, cooperation, empathy. They draft manifestos, build councils, march for peace. And for a while, they succeed long enough for the next generation to forget why their struggle mattered. Forgetfulness is the true architect of war. The ruins of one age become the classrooms of the next, and in them, new rulers learn not humility, but opportunity. Every peace treaty is just a blueprint for the next war. It is not cynicism, but observation. The pattern persists because the builders never change. They are human, bound by the same paradox that built the first city and forged the first sword. The longing for safety that creates danger. Still, somewhere in that recognition lies possibility. To see the pattern clearly is to begin to resist it. History's cycles endure only while they remain unconscious. Perhaps the next generation, standing amid the ruins, will recognize that the architects of the next war are not only the powerful, but all who forget the cost of calm. The blueprints are always waiting. The question, as always, is whether we will keep redrawing them, or finally learn how to build something that doesn't need to fall. We remember fire more easily than light. It is one of humanity's oldest instincts to look back at the blaze and call it warmth, to forget the burning and remember only the glow. Civilizations rise and fall by this selective memory, mistaking the beauty of destruction for proof of progress. We tell ourselves that the smoke was necessary, that the ashes were fertile, that we are wiser now. Yet beneath every age's triumph, a quiet truth smolders. We are still drawn to the fire, still chasing its shimmer through the ruins of what we built. Every myth we tell begins with flame. The gods give it as a gift, or a curse. Heroes steal it, prophets protect it. The story of civilization is the story of fire, first in the hearth, then in the forge, then in the gun, then in the sky. We have always equated its light with life, its danger with destiny. The memory of warmth is seductive. The memory of pain fades too quickly. So we rebuild, again and again, each generation lighting its own torch, each believing it will wield the fire better than the last. Even now, in our digital age, the symbol endures. The screens that glow in our hands are embers of a new flame, gentler, safer, but still hungry. They flicker with the same promise the ancients saw in their campfires: knowledge, control, connection. Yet every light we invent casts new shadows. The more we illuminate, the more we see what still lies unseen. The human heart, restless and unfinished, keeps reaching for the spark that might complete it, the one that will finally outshine the darkness. But the darkness is not outside us. It is the memory we carry within. Wars, revolutions, empires, all are ways of remembering the fire. We call them eras, we call them progress. But what they truly are is repetition. The soldier who lights the fuse, the leader who calls it destiny, the citizen who watches in awe, each reenacts the same ritual our ancestors performed around their first flames. We are addicted to motion. to the heat of purpose, to the illusion that conflict makes us alive, peace feels cold by comparison. Stillness frightens us because it reflects the void we have not yet learned to fill. Civilizations have tried to cure this addiction with reason, religion, and reform. Philosophers wrote of harmony, prophets preached forgiveness, scientists promised equilibrium. Yet every doctrine, every ideal, eventually finds itself tested by the same hunger it sought to calm. Even our moral systems bear the imprint of fire, reward, and punishment, heaven and hell, the spark of creation, the flame of judgment. We have learned to moralize combustion, to build ethics around its heat. The soul itself became a furnace, burning with desire, purified by trial, consumed by longing. This is why we rebuild after every fall. The ruins remind us of fragility, but they also remind us of the thrill of creation. The hands that clear the rubble are the same that will forge new weapons. The artists who paint peace will inspire new ambitions. Humanity cannot help but create, and creation, by its nature, disrupts. Each innovation carries a quiet violence within it, the displacement of what came before. The engine, the algorithm, the idea, all promise salvation while preparing transformation, and transformation is never gentle. Yet perhaps it is not destruction we crave, but renewal. The fire cleanses as much as it consumes. In its glow, we see what was hidden: our vanity, our greed, our capacity for compassion. The moments after catastrophe often feel like awakening. Strangers helping strangers, cities rebuilding with shared hands, the rediscovery of empathy. It is as if only by losing everything do we remember what truly matters. Maybe the memory of fire persists not as addiction, but as instruction, a warning we have never fully understood. Still, we repeat it. The poets of every century describe the same dream: to begin again, to rise from ashes, to make the next world kinder. But even in their hope, they acknowledge the danger. The phoenix burns as it is reborn. Rebirth demands another death. The memory of fire is both inspiration and curse. It keeps us evolving, but never content. Perhaps that is why peace never feels complete. The quiet after conflict unsettles us, as if silence itself were unnatural. We invent movement to fill it: industry, competition, entertainment. The modern age hums with this nervous energy, a soft echo of drums long silenced. We call it progress, but it is the same rhythm that once summoned armies. We no longer march to war. We scroll, we race, we consume. The battlefield is invisible now, but the restlessness remains. And yet, beneath this endless motion, something human still endures: the longing not for victory, but for understanding. The survivors of every age carry that quiet wisdom. They sit beside the ruins and do not rush to rebuild. They touch the charred stones and realize that the fire was never an enemy, only a mirror. It reflected what we were and what we feared to see. We remember fire more easily than light because the fire is honest. Light comforts, but it deceives, it hides the shadows that make it possible. Fire reveals everything: the beauty, the terror, the truth of what we are capable of. To remember it fully is to confront both creation and destruction as part of the same flame. In the stillness that follows, humanity always faces a choice. We can worship the embers, or we can learn from them. One path leads to another cycle, to new empires, new wars, new ruins. The other demands something rarer: restraint, patience, the courage to live without the fire's applause. True peace may not be warmth at all, but clarity, the quiet light that does not burn. But clarity is difficult to love. It offers no spectacle, no anthem, no glory. It simply waits, like dawn after a long night, asking only to be noticed. And so, we drift again toward motion, toward the familiar heat of becoming. The cycle restarts: the same flame, the same hands, the same mistake dressed as destiny. We remember fire more easily than light. Perhaps that is why history glows brighter in hindsight than in hope, because we see the brilliance, not the cost. Yet somewhere, in the heart of every ruin, a softer illumination persists. The promise that one day, memory will become wisdom, and the fire will finally rest. Until then, humanity carries its torch forward, trembling, luminous, alive, lighting the path toward another dawn, another age, another silence waiting to be broken. Empires end, but silence always survives. Long after the banners fade and the records crumble, there remains a hum, low, steady, almost invisible. It moves beneath the ruins, through the rivers, across the soil once stained by conquest. This hum is the pulse of what endures, the small, unyielding warmth of human compassion. History shouts, but humanity whispers. And it is in that whisper, not in the noise of glory, that our truest fire lives. The chronicles of power always begin with triumphs and end with collapse. They tell of kings, revolutions, treaties, and wars, all the noise that nations make to prove they were here. But beneath those pages lies another story, one written not by rulers but by survivors. It is the story of hands rebuilding, of songs returning, of laughter rising in the shadow of loss. For every empire that burned the world in its pursuit of order, there were mothers lighting candles, poets mending language, strangers helping strangers across a street. History may belong to the loud, but the future always grows in silence. The quiet fire does not command attention. It flickers in unnoticed places in a teacher's patience, in the touch of care for the dying, in the quiet resistance of those who refuse to hate. It is the flame that does not consume, the warmth that asks for nothing. Empires spend centuries trying to control the world, but this kind of peace cannot be conquered. It is not written into treaties or forced by armies. It breathes through empathy. It belongs to no nation and fears no fall. Perhaps that is what every civilization forgets, that peace does not live in marble halls, but in moments of kindness, too brief for record. When the Roman legions withdrew from the frontiers, when the last British ships sailed from their colonies, when the soldiers of every age laid down their weapons, what followed was not silence but restoration. Fields healed, forests grew back, languages blended, and children were born who knew nothing of the wars their fathers fought. Life, undeterred, continued its quiet work. The quiet fire also burns within art. When the cathedrals fell, the painters returned to their canvases. When the bombs stopped, musicians tuned their instruments again. Across centuries, art has been humanity's most faithful rebellion, the refusal to let pain have the final word. A single melody outlasts 100 battles. A poem written in exile can carry more truth than all the decrees of kings. Even when forgotten, art waits like embers, ready to reignite understanding. It is in creation that humanity rediscovers peace, not as an achievement, but as a rhythm. The painter's brushstroke, the gardener's planting, the writer's line, all are forms of prayer, reminders that beauty is a language older than fear. The empires that once sought to dominate through symbols of strength are remembered through their ruins, but the artists they censored are remembered through their grace. The quiet fire does not need monuments. It glows wherever sincerity survives. Some say this gentleness is weakness, that peace without defense is only an invitation for conquest. But those who live by the quiet fire understand that strength is not in the sword, but in restraint. True peace is not the absence of struggle, but the mastery of it, the ability to face chaos without becoming it. It is the courage to be still in a world addicted to movement. In this stillness, something ancient stirs the same awareness that guided the first humans who sat around the fire, watching its light flicker on their faces. They did not yet know of empires, or borders, or gods. They only knew that warmth meant survival, that gathering meant safety, that sharing meant hope. That instinct remains within us. Beneath all our complexity, we still seek that same circle of light, the one that asks nothing but presence. The quiet fire endures because it does not depend on victory. It asks only that we remember our humanity, even when history forgets it. Empires rise, promising salvation. Religions declare themselves eternal. Ideologies march in the name of justice. But all of them, in time, fade into echoes. What remains are the gestures that asked for nothing in return. A shared meal, a healed wound, a forgiven debt. These are the true foundations of peace, laid one silent act at a time. Even in the modern world, where noise has become the new empire, the quiet fire burns. It glows in the screens turned off before sleep, in the moments when someone pauses to watch rainfall, in the breath between thoughts. It is the awareness that we are not machines built for endless motion. It reminds us that silence is not emptiness, but a form of listening to one another, to the world, to the faint heartbeat of what is real. Perhaps that is how peace survives. Not through grand declarations, but through persistence. The same way grass cracks pavement, or dawn returns after the darkest night. The quiet fire cannot be extinguished because it does not rely on dominance. It exists wherever empathy exists, wherever creation continues, wherever someone chooses mercy over fear. When future civilizations study us, if they do, they may see our age as restless, divided, afraid. But if they look closer, they will find the same pulse that carried their ancestors through every collapse, the small, stubborn glow of human decency. That will be our legacy. Not the towers we build or the wars we wage, but the warmth we leave behind. Empires end, but silence always survives. And in that silence, the quiet fire waits patient, eternal, undefeated. It asks us to set down the weapons of pride and listen again to the hum beneath the noise. It reminds us that peace is not something to win, but something to remember. For in the end, all that endures is the light we shared, the warmth we gave, and the stillness we learned to keep. The rest, the empires, the glory, the noise was only the wind passing over the coals. And if we listen closely, beneath the ashes, we can still hear it, the quiet fire burning softly, teaching us how to begin again. The world forgets its wars, but the stars never forget our silence. The night returns as it always does, vast and unhurried. It folds over the ruins, the rivers, the bones of cities that once called themselves eternal. The last embers of empire fade beneath it, the walls become dust, the banners rot into soil, and the words that once commanded millions dissolve into wind. What remains is stillness. No drums, no sermons. Only the quiet breathing of the earth, as if it has finally forgiven us for trying to control it. Somewhere beneath that quiet sky lies the trace of every story ever lived. Rome, Persia, Babylon, names that once burned like suns now shimmer faintly in the memory of the cosmos. The gods, if they ever watched us, must have learned patience. They have seen our endless patterns, how we built towers to challenge the heavens, how we turned peace into conquest, how we mistook noise for meaning. Perhaps they no longer intervene. Perhaps they simply listen not to our victories, but to the silence that follows them. History, at its end, is not a roar, but an exhale. The chronicles of empires shrink into fragments, and what once filled libraries can be summarized in a sigh. The soldiers who dreamed of glory are dust now. The rulers who feared peace are remembered only by their mistakes. But the quiet acts, the compassion, the forgiveness, the brief kindnesses, those seem to echo longest. The universe remembers gentleness better than triumph. It is strange how the most fleeting things endure the most. A hand resting on another in forgiveness, a melody hummed in the ruins, a word whispered to a child about hope. These are not written in stone, but the stars seem to keep them anyway. When we look up, we call them constellations, but perhaps they are simply memories not of gods watching us, but of us watching one another, remembering how to be human. Even the earth remembers softly. In fields where soldiers once fell, flowers grow with impossible tenderness. In the courtyards where crowds once cheered for conquest, trees stretch upward, reclaiming the air. The oceans that carried fleets of war now cradle reflections of moonlight, indifferent and serene. The world continues its quiet labor of renewal, teaching without words that nothing beautiful ever truly dies, it only changes form. And maybe this is what peace was meant to be all along. Not an agreement between powers, but a surrender to time. A recognition that the universe moves with or without our consent. Every mountain, every tide, every rotation of the stars hums with the same lesson that permanence is an illusion, and surrender is not defeat but wisdom. Empires feared peace because peace could not be ruled. Yet in the end, it is peace that rules them all. In this final silence, the narrator becomes a listener. The echoes of history recede, and what remains is soundless understanding. The voices of prophets and conquerors, kings and scholars, fade into the same frequency, indistinguishable, forgiven. The noise that once filled centuries resolves into harmony, and the line between victory and loss disappears. There is no empire left to defend, no faith left to impose. Only continuity, the same soft rhythm that began before us and will continue after. If the gods remember us, they remember the stillness more than the storm. Not the empires, but the moments between them. Not the monuments, but the silences in which we learn to love. Perhaps they remember the first child who looked up at the stars and felt wonder instead of fear, or the last soldier who, seeing his enemy fall, felt pity instead of triumph. These are the gestures that reach beyond history, beyond belief. Small acts of clarity in a world that spent so long searching for meaning. The stars above, untouched and patient, have seen it all. They have watched us rise from dust and return to it, watched our prayers turn to smoke and our promises to myth. And still they shine, not in judgment, but in continuity. Light older than our civilizations drifts toward us, whispering reminders of how brief our noise has always been. What we call eternity is only their way of waiting. And so the story ends as it began, in quiet. The fire that once consumed worlds now glows softly in the hearts of those who remain. The ruins are no longer warnings, but altars of remembrance. The silence is no longer feared, but understood. It is not the absence of life, but its completion. Perhaps this is what the gods remember, not our wars, not our empires, but our attempt to rise above them, our longing for meaning, our effort, however flawed, to reach the light. The stars do not judge the flames that tried to mimic them. They simply absorb their stories, fold them into the endless dark, and wait for the next spark. The world sleeps now, not in despair, but in peace. Cities rest beneath the soil like dreams, and the rivers carry their reflections to the sea. Somewhere, a poet writes by candlelight. Somewhere, a child dreams of a sky without borders. The night is vast, but it is not empty. It hums with everything we were, everything we lost, and everything we still might become. Empires end, but silence always survives. And in that silence, something eternal listens, not a god, not a nation, but the quiet fire of being itself. It remembers us not for our dominion, but for our capacity to feel, to forgive, to begin again. The stars will fade someday too, as all things do. But even then, the memory will remain the faint echo of a species that learned, at last, that peace was never something to fear. For when all else is gone, what the gods remember is the silence we finally made our home.